Then I would like to hand over to Odile and Jérôme. I don't know now who's sharing, but go ahead.
I would say that Jérôme is sharing, and I will take the floor first, if you don't mind.
Okay, yes.
Oh, you want me to share the...
Yeah, can you do it, please?
Ah, okay. I didn't do it.
Well, mine was kind of hectic, so.
Wait.
So we can just start introducing ourselves very shortly. So I'm an associate professor of economics at the University of Grenoble and a member of Labo 1.5, and we'll talk about this collective group later on. And I am here today just to talk about the tool that Jérôme and I and other people, of course, have contributed to develop, which is called, we call it in French, GES 1.5. GES is greenhouse gas in French, and 1.5 is obvious for people working on climate, I guess. Thank you, Jérôme. Jérôme, just can you introduce yourself probably, if you don't mind?
Oh, yeah. So I'm Jérôme Mariette. I'm an engineer in INRAe in Toulouse, and I'm working and with Odile since 2 years now, and many people from Labo 1.5 on the development of this tool that we're going to present you today.
Thank you. So the main goal of this presentation today is to present the tool GES 1.5. I will always talk about GES 1.5 in different respects. So about the goals, about the methodology, and what we do with it in the end, what we have started to do, particularly in terms of research, and how you can contribute to our research too. So the goals of GES 1.5 have been, since the beginning, we have always said that we would like to estimate the carbon footprint of the public research sector in France. That's the main goal, ultimate goal, I would say. And for that, we decided to do it from the bottom up and particularly work on the carbon footprint of the research lab. And so give the research labs in France a tool to estimate their carbon footprint, which means that the goal is, first of all, to identify the lab's emission level, to build and implement the appropriate mitigation actions based on what the lab will have found in terms of carbon footprint, as well as using this tool to raise the awareness of the lab employees and involve them into the actions of the laboratory to face the climate urgency that we all know. For that, we also decided that if we want to work for all the research labs in France, we want to develop a shared methodology, a common one, and which will help us to make fruitful analysis so totally consistent. We are also given us the goal of providing a free and open source tool, which everyone can access and can use and develop also from the code that is behind it. And in the end, all the work that we do on the research labs leading to the carbon footprint of the public research sector in France will be to contribute to an emerging research field, which is the carbon footprint of research activities worldwide. So what are the main features of GES 1.5? As I said, it's a standardized methodology. And the methodology, first of all, complies with the current French regulation. France is probably one of the only country in the world that has regulation about greenhouse gas inventories of lots of institutions, and particularly public institutions. Laboratories do not have to comply to this regulation because they are not legally institutions, but the big institutions gathering all the laboratories like INRAe or INRAe, they do have to do this greenhouse gas inventory. So we comply with the methodology that has been written by the French state and the French government, I would say, we comply with that to do the greenhouse gas emissions inventory of the laboratories. But we also account for the specificities of the research labs. And we'll give you an example afterwards. And what we want to do is, first of all, focus on the most significant emission sources of most research labs. We do not want to do an exhaustive list of all the emissions that have been generated by a laboratory, but just focus on the most significant ones. So in the first version that we have made public late in October last year, the emission sources that are considered include the ones linked to the buildings where the laboratories are, and particularly the consumptions of electricity, heating, and refrigerant gases. On the other side, they also include the emissions from traveling, which means professional travel for different professional reasons, as well as commuting from home to the workplace. And we decided also to work on a year-by-year basis for each laboratory, which means that when a laboratory has started to do its greenhouse gas inventory, it's invited to do it year after year, because, well, you know, when you have done the effort once, it's relatively easy to do it the second year, and it will bring you much information about the actions that you have implemented. So the calculation methodology, those of you who are familiar with greenhouse gas inventories will find it very understandable. And for the others, it's quite easy to understand. The basic formula is for each greenhouse gas emission source, it's about multiplying the quantity of activity by its emission factor, which is how much one unit of this activity emits in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And I give you an example with the greenhouse gas emissions of a car that is owned by a laboratory. And what are these emissions over a year? So we need to get the annual distance traveled by this car and multiply it by the emission factor of 1 kilometer driven by a car, a standardized car in France, which is, for this car, it's 241 grams of equivalent CO2 per kilometer traveled. To get these emission factors, we are really lucky in France because we have a big database that is public, that is free, and that is updated very often, which is provided by the ADEME, which is an official public agency for the environment. So we call it, it's called base carbon, and we have more than 3,000 emission factors in this database. And what we did in the GES 1.5 is we created emission factors, particularly when they were not available in the database because they were specific to research. And I'll give you an example just below here. So some researchers go to sea and they go on a ship to do research campaigns about whatever they work on the oceans or any sea. And so it has a big carbon cost. So those researchers have estimated the emissions per day at sea for a whole group of people. So this is one of the emission factors that is included in the tool. So how do we how do laboratories carry out this inventory of their greenhouse gas emissions? And we have to determine this process for every lab, and they all have to go through this process to be sure that everyone is on the same length wave. And particularly, there are prerequisites that we really want every lab to comply with. First of all, well, we have to find volunteers, at least one volunteer in the research lab to coordinate the whole inventory. The second thing, which is very important to us, is that they have this volunteer or these volunteers have to get the agreement of the head of the laboratory, the director or whatever you call them. It's fundamental that this person really agrees with the process. And another aspect that is very important too is presenting the whole greenhouse gas inventory process to all the colleagues. Explain them why the laboratory will carry out a greenhouse gas inventory and how it will do it, and how people will be integrated in this process. Once this first step has been done, the big step is about collecting the data and harmonize them to GES 1.5 standard. So we have a list of data required, and laboratories have to comply with it because they have to collect them before putting them into the tool. The next phase is upload the data into GES 1.5, which is relatively easy from what we get for the laboratories. And in the end, which is the most interesting part, is get the results, tables, graphs, and export them and analyze them for the laboratories. So data collection, what we ask people to get for every laboratory in terms of electricity and heating, we need the data about the floor area occupied by the laboratory in each building, because laboratories may share the same building with other people. What are the energy sources for heating, which could be public heating, could be gas heating or whatever. And what is the consumption? So people have to get the bills from the suppliers, and so just put the data into the tool. For the refrigerant gases, people have to find the bills from the companies that maintain the cooling system of the labs, because within these bills, you'll find the fugitive gases that have been just flown away from the system. For vehicles, we ask for distances traveled for cars, motorcycles, and scooters. We ask for hours in operation for airplanes and helicopters. And we ask for days at sea for ships, as explained previously. In terms of professional travel, we have to get to the accounting systems of the different laboratories and extract data from these databases, asking for departure location, arrival location, the mode of transportation, the purpose of travel, the professional status, so that we can do statistical analysis afterwards. And well, people have to harmonize these data into GES 1.5 format, and the tool will calculate the distances traveled using GeoNames database. For commuting, we have an annual survey that is totally standardized. And we provide it to in the tool, and the people have to just set it to all the staff of the laboratory to identify the number of commuting days, the modes of transportation, and the distances traveled for each mode. So in terms of output, I just show you 2 slides, and you will see the next. In the end, Jérôme will show you the whole tool by itself. And so one of the outputs is the regulatory inventory, the way it has to show up in the regulation, the French regulation. So it looks, if some of you are familiar with the greenhouse gas protocol format, it's this format, covering scope 1, which is direct emissions, scope 2, which is indirect emissions from energy purchased, and scope 3, which are all the other emissions. So this is the way we present it, but we don't find it interesting in terms of analysis, and that's why we created another output, which is the carbon footprint. And here, if you have the distribution of the footprint between the buildings and travel, and within the buildings, how much heating, electricity, and refrigerant gases weigh into this carbon footprint of buildings and carbon footprint of traveling. How is the distribution between commuting and professional travel? We find it much more interesting this way, particularly to act after that. And the output to Jérôme has created, so I just show you one of them, but Jérôme has created graphs that are really interesting to analyze. And particularly here, I'll just give you an example with commuting. So we have a graph showing emissions, so distributed by modes of transportation as well as distributed by professional status. And on the right-hand side, you have the distances traveled distributed the same way. So you may really have nice analysis, and particularly here, when you look at the train on the right-hand side, you see that the distances traveled by the people commuting by train are really high. But in terms of emissions in France, they are very low, just because our trains are electric, and electricity comes from the nuclear power in France, which is almost decarbonized. The tool helps also, well, we try to help people as much as we could to work on this, their inventory. And so there are help resources in the tool, as well as a discussion forum that Jérôme has built up, which allows labs to exchange ideas, exchange questions also. They answer to each other. We also intervene when needed. And there are also local discussions at the regional level, like in the city, between colleagues who do their greenhouse gas inventory and have different problems. So all this contributes to getting answers to what is maybe difficult for some. So what next for the laboratory when the lab inventory is finished? First of all, the one thing is, as people have answered at least to the commuting survey, they may be really interested in knowing the whole carbon footprint of the lab. So it's about presenting the result to the laboratories, to the colleagues of the laboratory. And then, of course, it's a matter of analyzing the carbon footprint, which sources emit most in the laboratory, why? And depending on the laboratories, responses are very, very different. I can give you examples later on. And then it's about also collective discussions within the lab about actions, which mitigation actions are possible, acceptable, economically feasible, what time horizon. And for that, we have at Labo 1.5, so the whole collective action and all the, well, not all the members, but the team within Labo 1.5, which is called experimentation, has developed a tool that I'll talk about later on, just to help laboratories have these collective discussions and get to the actions that they want to develop. And of course, also, as I said, as the inventory is made to be made every year, they can prepare for the next inventory. At GES 1.5 level, what is next for us? We are currently working on a second version of GES 1.5. And this second version will include the carbon footprint of digital equipments of the laboratory and the carbon footprint of purchased goods, which is very, very hard because purchased goods are very heterogeneous and totally different from one laboratory to the other, just depending on the subject, the research subject of the lab. And beyond that, we want to, first of all, try to work on the carbon footprint of collaborative research projects and the carbon footprint of collaborative research equipments, like the one that I have presented to some of you who were present here, Evelyn, Melissa, and Jacob and Sophie, when we presented the carbon footprint of the grant project with the astrophysics grant project in March, last March. GES 1.5 is, as I said in the introduction, we have a goal of working in terms of research. So GES 1.5 is just a tool, but we want to go beyond that, not only bringing the tool to the laboratories. And particularly because GES 1.5 allows and, well, asks laboratories to store their inventories into the tool, research will be available just due to these greenhouse gas inventories that are stored in the tool. And particularly now, we have already more than 200 laboratories that have signed in GES 1.5 and started their greenhouse gas inventory. So we hope that very soon they will have finished it and will already be able to work on these greenhouse gas inventories and do some research about all the questions that may be raised about the carbon footprint of the public research sector in France. And first of all, well, we would like to find an estimation, well, define a methodology to estimate from the bottom up the carbon footprint of the public research sector from this database. There are some top-down estimates that will be available, at least from the big research centers like INRAe, INRAe. And we would like to cross-check our findings from the bottom with those top-down estimates. It would be great if we could just get to the same point about the same point. This research will also focus on the distribution of emissions across emission sources, across categories of staff, across disciplines, across regions. I mean, there are lots and lots of different ideas that we want to work with, and it's just open for now. We're just waiting for all these laboratories to have finished their greenhouse gas inventory, and we'll work on with them about that. And of course, beyond that, we also want to think in terms of options for public policies to mitigate the carbon footprint of research. This is our ultimate goal in this way. GES 1.5 also contributes to Labo 1.5 experimentation research project, as I just mentioned it to you. And so there's a wonderful team, which is called l'équipe expérimentation, and it's led by Audrey Sabat and Olivier Ragnaud, that you can see here on the slide. And the idea is to define, well, not to define, but to identify mitigation action solutions in the laboratories, and they have to be designed locally and from a collective experience at the laboratory level. And so this team from Labo 1.5 has already started bringing support to the laboratories in terms of accompanying and facilitating all the debates and decision-making procedures that may be at stake when the laboratories will discuss about these different options. And for that, this team has created a 300 pages kit 1.5 explaining what are the main options that a laboratory can take. And I give you just a few examples about, carbon tax, of course, quotas, but also raise awareness through different, serious gaming, for example, and so on. So 300 pages for showing all the options, well, not all, but many options at the table for laboratories to choose within, just to discuss within the laboratory about which is the most acceptable or the most economically feasible action for the laboratory. So this is support, and they have created this big kit. And now they also want to make research and particularly investigate about how the different laboratories come to any decision, whatever it is, but any mitigation decision. And for that, they will have people going into the labs and watching what happens, document the entire process, and evaluate the different effects of the reduction options that have been taken by the different laboratories. For this year, so it's about this experience of collective deliberation in the research labs. It's a pilot project for 2021 with 17 laboratories over the territory in France, and they will, first of all, they have to do their carbon footprint with GES 1.5. This is the first step. And then they will discuss the reduction options at the scale of the laboratories, just using this kit 1.5 and using it the way they want to, just look at all the options on the table and which are the ones that could be implemented in the laboratory. In the end, after working with these pilot laboratories, and the idea is to scale up to the largest possible number of laboratories in 2022 and beyond, of course. What next with GES 1.5 also, this time internationally, and our goal is that a tool be replicable in any country. It is, in some way, it is already replicable. First of all, it's an open source, it's free access, it gives free access to its internal code. But there are a few adaptations needed. Now, the first one is that the tool is in French, and we are relatively very few people working on the tool. And so we lack labor, we lack help to translate the interface. And the other big thing is that in every country, the emission factors are different, particularly in terms of electricity. And so the emission factors will have to be customized to the country. So the tool is ready, almost ready for going internationally, but it needs some adaptations. And we would like to get in the end to be able altogether to estimate the carbon footprint of research worldwide. So this is where I stop here, and I give the floor to Jérôme, who will show you part of the tool through just a few slides showing what it looks like.
So thanks, Odile, for the presentation. Okay. So thank you, Odile, for the presentation. I will present you on my side a small demonstration of the tool. So as the tool has been designed for French laboratories, the interface is all in French. We are planning to provide the user language support, multi-language support, but it's not done yet. So what I'm going to present you today is a French interface, and I apologize for that, but I will try my best to make you understand what is behind. So when you start to go to the welcome page of the tool, there is the main message that is addressed to the user that the tool is designed for two main objectives. That is, as Odile said, to perform, to make a national French study about the research carbon footprint. And on the other side, it's a tool dedicated to help laboratories to manage and to monitor their carbon emissions. So the tool is composed of all the features of the tools features are gathered on the left panel, with on the top the documentation, where you can access to the methodology that Odile presented to you before. This is quite a bit long, but this is really required to understand how the calculations are made. On the same page, there is all the emissions factors that are used by all the database used by the tool to make the calculation. This is provided to the user mainly in order to allow the user to perform the same calculation on its own and to be able to understand what is behind. So from the welcome page, there is two different ways to use GES 1.5. There is, if the user signs in the system, the data will be collected and saved on our servers, on our computers. What requires first an authorization of the director of the laboratory. And this allows the user to participate to the French national study on research on the carbon emission research impact, but also to monitor its carbon emissions through the years. The user can also use GES 1.5 anonymously. In this case, he won't participate to the study, but won't provide the data to Labo 1.5. So if he doesn't have the consentment of the director of the laboratory, he can perform the carbon footprint without providing the data. In both cases, the interface is quite the same. The only difference mainly is that there is no data storage. So when the user signs in the system, he has another menu on the left that allows to access to GES 1.5, but allows as well, before to start a new carbon footprint, the user is required to provide some data on the on its laboratory, data such as the scientific discipline. This metadata is really useful for us for the national study in order to make some statistics on the research carbon footprint. But also it will be collected like the size of the city, which will be used by the system in order to choose the right emission carbons factors for the calculation. For example, for the common transportation in city, it's depending, the emission factor is depending of the size, if it's a small city or a big city. So when the user starts a new carbon footprint, he has some data to provide, like the head count of the laboratory, but also some data about the effectives in terms of researchers, engineers, or PhD and PhD fellowships, which will be used to calculate the commutes emissions, daily commute emissions. So once the carbon footprint created with this metadata, the user will have access to the different modules, the building modules, the vehicles, but also the professional travels and the daily commute modules. From the buildings, he will be able to add new buildings where he will have to provide consumption of energy in terms of electricity, but also in terms of refrigerant gases and in terms of heating. As example, we provide multiple emissions factors for the urban network defined considering the city where the laboratory is placed. In the same way, the user can add the different vehicles owned by the laboratory. In this way, you can add like cars, planes, but also boats, like explained Odile. We have some emissions factors tuned for research and, for example, for oceanographic research with sea campaigns emissions factors. So there is the modules for professional travels. These modules require a file with a specific format, but we added different formats coming from the different information system of the institute. For example, in France, there is the CNRS and the INRAe, and they can provide to their user, to their labs, an extraction of their professional travels that can be read by our system. But the main idea is to have this information, like the city, country, the departure of the city and country of departure, but also the arrivals. We collect also some travels mode and some metadata to perform some statistics, like the purpose of the travel or the worker status. In the same way, the daily commutes require a file that is an extraction of a survey. So in this purpose, we created a survey on a survey platform, which is a French survey platform provided by Framaform, who is really taking care about personal data. To perform this survey, the user will have to clone the survey that we provide, which is standardized. And when cloned, the user will send to all his colleagues these forms. And then after 2 weeks, he will be able to extract the forms and upload it to the system. Once everything is done, once the user completed the different modules, he doesn't actually have to have the data for each module. Some laboratories doesn't own any vehicles. So to get the results, it's only required to have only one module to be validated. But once you want to get to the result, yes, well, I forgot about these two slides. Once he got to the results, he got the regulatory table, which is in agreement with the French and European regulation, from where he can have all its emission from the different scopes, but also different graphics representing the regularity table that can be exported. From a more user-friendly representation, the tool also provides some outputs mainly based on what we can more understand in a lab, meaning the heating electricity emission, but also the professional travels and daily commutes. The user can also export the data from this table and access some graphicals to understand better, like here the professional travels emissions, or here the daily commutes emissions gathered from different with different metadata. So these graphicals, there are more upcoming. For example, we are implementing right now some module to compare multiple carbon footprint. And this is really useful to compare through years and to compare carbon footprint from the same year with different emissions factors. So, well, this is the end of the talks for my part and from Odile. So now it's time for questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jérôme, and thank you very much, Odile. The last message I just sent in the chat was just meant for Evelyn, not for everyone. But you can see that we are very impressed by the tool you have just showed. It seems really, really professional and very detailed. When starting with, let's start with the questions we have in the chat.